This morning I want to follow the theme of being faithful in an ungodly place. Some of you might know Hugh Latimer. Hugh Latimer was a great preacher, a fellow at Cambridge University. He became Bishop of Worcester. He was also chaplain to Edward VI. One day, Hugh Latimer was preaching in the presence of King Henry VIII. And he reports that he said to himself, Latimer, Latimer, remember that the king is here. Be careful what you say. Then he said to himself, Latimer, Latimer, remember that the King of Kings is here. Be careful what you do not say. For his unflinching faithfulness, Latimer was eventually burned at the stake. He feared failing God more than he feared offending men. In other words, he feared God more than men. In that story, we find that kind of character. When we study the story of Elijah, it is very easy to overlook Obadiah. He is a man of God. Elijah is a man of God, bold and fearless, and always at the forefront of the action. Obadiah can be overlooked or belittled as of no importance because he was just Ahab's servant, a quiet believer living a life in a very, very difficult situation in the court of Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel, especially an ardent worship of foreign gods. She killed many of the prophets of Israel and those who worshipped the true God, Yahweh. Ahab also teamed up with her. And you can see, as you heard the reading, that king is more concerned about his horses than about people in that drought. And you can see the kind of situation Obadiah was living. A quiet believer living life in a very difficult situation. Therefore, his life can largely be hidden. And he is the one who is not much talked about. And I think there's a lesson here. We must be very careful not to undervalue men of God who are quiet and retiring and who do not demonstrate their faith in dramatic and obvious fashions. The true servant of God may be serving well under great disadvantages and fierce opposition, but scarcely known and recognized, unlike those on a center stage. When we read different commentaries, many commentators say that Obadiah was a compromiser. He was power hungry and looking for wealth and prosperity more than concerned about his faith. But I disagree with many of those commentators. I like to agree with those who describe Obadiah as a palm in the desert, because he stood for the Lord in a time of great national apostasy. When others were turning to idolatry, this man elevated to a high position and would not bow the knees before Baal or Baal. Question is, how did he do that? How did he survive in an ungodly place and remain faithful to God? And not only that, he used his position to save godly people and honored him. I'd like to point out 2-3 things this morning. The secrets of his faithfulness. As we read verse 12, we find Obadiah speaking about himself. He said, I, your servant, have feared the Lord since my youth. We do not know how Obadiah came to fear the Lord in his youth, but I think it would be a fair assumption that it was the result of his parents' influence on his life. And the clue can be found in his name. Obadiah means the servant of the Lord. Obviously, to give a name like that to a child shows that his parents had connection with God. They knew the true God of Israel. Remember, Obadiah was born in days when there was persecution of God's people and servants everywhere, and the name of the Lord was in contempt. So to call a child Obadiah required firm conviction and courage by the parents. Notice how Obadiah describes his relationship with God. He says, I have feared the Lord. Now our translation in NIV says, I have worshipped. But I think fear is closer to the original Hebrew. And Bible has a lot to say about the fear of the Lord. It does not mean being terror-stricken or dread the Lord. It means reverence for the Lord in light of his majesty, having high esteem for God. Fear of the Lord reminds us that God is great and greatly to be praised. And it makes us concerned not to sin against him, not to do wrong. And it causes us to maintain a tender conscience. That's why Psalm 110, 11, verse 10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12 says, what does the Lord ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. That was the requirement for God's people in both the Old and the New Testament. And those who fear the Lord, blessings are promised to them. Psalm 25, verse 12 says, God will instruct him, the one who fears, in the way chosen for him. How great is your goodness which you have stored up for those who fear you. His mercy extends to those who fear him. Obadiah feared God. He had a great reverence in his heart. And he did not just say he believed or obeyed or loved the Lord, but that he feared about him. That he had his conscience always awakened. Obadiah belonged to God in his youth. He had experience of his presence in his life from the beginning. I think it is always beautiful when people belong to the Lord from their early days in life. They are saved from evil habits which are often hard to throw off once learned. There are many things they do not have to unlearn later in life, and they are saved from many sorrows and a great deal of shame. How we ought to pray and work for the conversion of our children and grandchildren early in their lives. How we ought to support and encourage those who work among the young people to win the young for Christ. It is important to have that foundation from early in life if we are to survive in places of ungodliness. Secondly, Obadiah not only had this firm foundation, he had to put that firm foundation into practice. It is his persistence that allowed him to be faithful in an ungodly place. And so in declaring that he has feared the Lord from his youth, Obadiah implies that he is still going on with the Lord. He's where he is, where he has always been down the years. And this is confirmed because of the comment of the writer of the first Kings in the beginning of his account. It says Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. Chapter 18, verse 3. Fear and reverence for the Lord began in his youth and was still growing and developing. You see, passing the time had not changed him. Years made no difference. He remained faithful in times of temptation. When others fell away, times of adversity and times of prosperity did not affect him. Persecution and discouragements left him unscathed. He maintained that relationship with God even though the whole nation had turned its back on God, and that was led by king and queen. Obadiah had no teaching or fellowship to enjoy. A fellowship that will keep him true to the Lord. He was living in the center of ungodliness, the royal palace. He was in close contact with queen and the king. And yet, he remained faithful to God. You see, loneliness, isolation, whatever the circumstances, it is impossible to emphasize the difficulty that he was in. No matter what knowledge and experience the Christian has, it is harrowing to be alone. Isolation from other Christians has caused the spiritual temperature of many Christians to decline, like a coal taken out of the fire. Only those who have been in that situation would know it. And I can personally testify to that. I was one of 3 Christian students in the college, in a class of 100 or more, and sometime I was alone in that class. Holding on to faith in such an environment is not an easy thing. And Paul also knew this experience. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, he says, "At my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. The Lord stood at my side and gave me strength." See, we need to pray that support may be given to us in our hour of need, when we feel alone, when we feel isolated. I remember an incident when I stood up to my Muslim professor when he made some remarks about Christian faith in college. I don't know what gave me that courage to say what I said to him. While most of my friends in college were trying to hide their faith, they didn't want anybody to know that they were Christians. See, it is not easy to remain faithful in an ungodly place. Obadiah did that. We must remember to encourage the lonely ones, for they are so easily overlooked. And third and last thing, you see, sometimes people ask me or wonder why I spend my time, energy, my own holidays, and even resources to go out to Pakistan, teach or preach and be with Christians there. Well, one of the main reasons is this. I believe to encourage and support those who are persecuted, whose faith is under severe pressure, and who find difficult to be faithful in the face of opposition. This is what Obadiah seems to be doing in this story. He doesn't keep his own faith intact, but proved the reality of his faithfulness to God is by using his office to further God's kingdom, God's cause. Obadiah felt he could do something for the cause of God. He held an important office with great influence. He was the right-hand man of King Ahab. He did all he could for God's cause, saving the lives of at least 100 of the Lord's prophets by hiding them in caves and feeding them and giving them water to drink. He protected them from the bloodthirsty queen. He watched over them and he did not betray them. I think he must have taken quite a risk. I think he put his life at stake and used his own purse on quite a grand scale, feeding 100 people day by day for that length of time needs some resources. And Obadiah is not the only one. There are others in the Bible who have proved that it is possible to hold high position in an ungodly court, an ungodly place, without losing their own faith, without losing principles. For instance, Joseph feared God in the court of Pharaoh. Daniel was the trusted counselor of Nebuchadnezzar. There are others in the history of Christianity who did the same. For instance, in our church history, John Wycliffe, who made the first attempt to translate the whole Bible into English, met fierce opposition from the authorities, and some followers paid with their lives. But Wycliffe was kept safe because of the Duke of Lancaster's protection. Then Luther, when he stood against the church and is dealing with people. He was saved by Elector Frederick of Saxony and Wartburg Castle because there was danger of him being hanged or burned. I have personally visited Wartburg, and I went into the room where Luther sat and translated the New Testament in just 12 weeks. Being faithful in the place of ungodliness is not an easy thing. Obadiah knew God from his early age, and that gave him firm foundation. His faith never faded as years passed by. And so let me ask, how do we react in ungodly places? Places where people don't share our faith or even actively oppose us as Christians. That place can be a workplace where we work, or it could be closer to home. It could be our own family, where we are the only one standing for Christian faith, going to church, taking part in Christian activities. And sometimes we feel in that family, I am the only one. And sometimes we feel opposed, restricted. How do we react to that? Well, take heart from Obadiah. He remained faithful. And how do we use our gifts, talents, and position to support, encourage, protect, and sustain those whose faith comes under fire time and time again? Above all, remember Jesus himself, who faced fierce opposition, but rather than giving in, he chose to be faithful to the will of his Father. And he said, your will be done, not mine. He chose to please God rather than pleasing men. Remember Latimer's words. Latimer, Latimer, the King of Kings is here. Be careful what you do not say. May the Lord enable us to be faithful in ungodly places. Amen.